The Sample, Hold and Slew is a 12 HP Eurorack module, and it's available in a black or a silver front panel. It's a multi-function module, but at its core it has both Sample and Hold and Track and Hold, along with a Restrict feature. It also features a noise source, with both a colour control and a selectable option for clipped noise. You can use this to generate random and pseudo-random control voltages, staircase waveforms, deliberate aliasing of audio signals, portamento type effects, adjustable audio range noise, and much more. The slew function is available independently and can be switched between either an exponential or a linear response. The wide-ranging onboard clock is always available and can be used independently. It can function as a square wave LFO, or it can be converted to a triangle waveform by feeding it through the slew section. In both Sample and Hold and Track and Hold modes, the unique Restrict control affects the way the module transitions from one randomly generated voltage to another. The output can be restricted to move by a reduced amount after each new sample, in which case the output will still have the same range as the input, but it will need more hold commands to get there. Sample and Hold can also be used for audio processing. It can create a downsampling or bit reducing effect. The coarseness or the severity of the effect will vary with the clock speed. Or we can create 8-bit Atari type sounds if noise is patched to the sample input rather than external audio. This is the Sample and Hold module, and the panel is aluminium, as it is with all the modules, and it's very slim, so it's suitable for skiff cases. On the back, this is the power connector, and the bottom 2 pins are for the minus 12 volt rail, so you need to connect your red stripe on the cable to these pins at the bottom, and likewise on the case when you install it. The Sample and Hold uses its inbuilt noise source or external audio to generate CV signals in a random or partially controlled way. At every clock pulse, it will very quickly scan over the noise of the incoming audio and convert that into a control voltage, the output of which can be sent to control other modules, in this case sending it to the 1 volt per octave input of this VCO. And if I change the rate of its internal clock, then it will determine how quickly it takes a new sample. Track and Hold differs from Sample and Hold because it alternates between taking a sample of the internal noise or incoming audio, using that to generate a control voltage, and then holding it for a period of time determined by either the internal clock or an external clock signal. And then, as seen here when the LED lights up, simply allowing that noise or audio signal to pass directly through to the output. This means that when the gate signal is high, any module connected to either the Sample and Hold or the slew output is being directly affected by the noise or audio passing through the sample and hold module. And so if it's connected to the CV input of another module, then that noise or audio is being used directly as a control voltage. It's still affected by the same controls as sample and hold. So the colour signal will still change the source of internal noise that it takes the samples from. And restrict will also still work. As will whether or not you're using clip noise. In fact, the track and hold does work particularly well with clip noise, as I'll demonstrate by using it to modulate this filter. And here I can use the clock output to trigger an envelope generator, in this case the inverted output of the DH ADSR, and then use that to control the VCA. With the rate pot turned all the way down to 0, this turns the clock off. Above that, the range sweeps from 1 cycle every 30 seconds to over 2 kHz. And this is normalised to the clock input of the sample and hold section. Because this is essentially a low frequency oscillator, it produces a +5 to -5 volt signal at the clock out socket, so it can be used to control other modules. The rate LED is actually connected to the input of the sample and hold rather than the internal clock. So it will flash either in time with the internal clock or in time with the signal coming in by the clock input. The sample and hold can also use an external clock. So send this square wave into the clock input. I can then use an external module to control its speed. The slew control determines the amount of time that the module takes to reach a new generated voltage. So if I slow its speed, you'll start to hear a glide style effect between the notes. This is in linear mode, which means there'll be a very even transition from one voltage to the other. Whereas an exponential, the speed at which it changes to each new voltage will vary in speed as it follows an exponential curve rather than a straight line. This can work particularly well with a filter. Here it's filtering some pink noise. Each time there's a clock pulse, it generates a new voltage. But if the slew is slow enough, then it possibly won't reach the new voltage before it has to change direction again and move towards the subsequent generated control voltage. This could be good for creating wind effects. Here I have the CV out of a sequencer going into the slew section of the module, and then the output going to the CV in to control the pitch of these 3 VCOs. If I take the gate output from this sequencer and connect it to the slew gate input, then it will disable the slew until it receives a high gate signal. And at the moment I've got all the gates for each of these 6 steps turned off. But if I activate the gate on steps 2 and 5, now you can hear that the slew only occurs on those 2 steps. So at the moment I'll only get slew on a note if that particular step on the sequencer is sending a gate signal. But if I flick the gate invert switch, then the opposite will be true. So now I'll get slew on all of the steps except for 2 and 5, which are sending a gate signal. But because the sample and hold section of this module is completely separate from the slew, they can both be used simultaneously. So if I take the clock output from the sequencer and go to the clock in, you'll see that the LED starts to flash at a different rate. So it's receiving clock from the sequencer at the moment, and I've divided the clock output into 3 pulses per step. And now I can use that sample and hold output to modulate the filter. So that I'll get 3 different random voltages per step on the sequencer. Also, if there's nothing connected to the slew gate input, then the gate invert switch just becomes a convenient on-off switch for the slew effect. At the moment the module's applying slew between all of the notes, but you can change to just slew up, so that it's only active when there's an increase in CV signal, or down. Just as audio can be used as a source from which to generate random voltages, you could also take the output from the sample and hold module and go straight to a VCA or a filter and then a VCA, and actually listen to its output directly. Here I've got a radio music module and some audio from the beginning of the video running through the bandpass filter on the Sonic XV, just so I can change the tonal range of the information that I'm sending to the sample and hold module. And then I'll experiment with different settings in both sample and hold and track and hold mode, so you can hear what it does to the audio.
And it's available in a black or silver front panel. It's a multi-function module that at its core has both sample and hold and track and hold, along with a responsive feature. It also features a noise feature with both a colour control and a selected option to clip noise. You can use this to generate random and pseudo-random control voltages, the staircase waveform, deliberate aliasing of audio signals, the cement exhaust effect, adjustable audio rate noise, and much more. The 3 functions are available independently. It can be switched between either an exponential or a linear response. Externally, the wide-ranging onboard clock is always available and can be used independently. It can function as a square wave diaphragm, or it can be converted to a triangle waveform by feeding through the slew setting. In both sample and hold and track and hold modes, the unique split control affects the way the module transitions from one randomly generated voltage to another. The output can be restricted to move by reducing the output to the sample, and this can set up that the selected range of input, but there is no hold command for that one. Sample and hold can also be used for audio processing. but invalidate the clock speed. Or we can create 8-bit Atari type sounds if noise is patched to the sample input rather than external audio. The sample, hold and slew is a 12 HP Eurorack module and it's available in a black or a silver front panel. It's a multi-function module. At its core, it has both sample and hold and track and hold, along with a restrict feature. It also features a noise source with both a colour control and a selectable option for clips noise. You can use this to generate random and pseudo-random control voltages, staircase waveforms, deliberate aliasing of audio signals, portamento type effects, adjustable audio range noise, and much more. The slew function is available independently and can be switched between either an exponential or a linear response. And finally, the wide-ranging onboard clock is always available and can be used independently. It can function as a square wave LFO, or it can be converted to a triangle waveform by feeding it through the slew section.
This is the sound of the internal noise coming from the sample and hold. And the colour control is a bidirectional control that, when turned anti-clockwise, applies low pass filtering to the noise output. And when turned clockwise, it applies high pass filtering. Clips noise is a much hotter signal, so it's driving the noise level harder and then applying hard clipping to the signal, which has the effect of causing the highest and lowest frequencies to be sandwiched together. The difference isn't so easily noticeable just by listening to it as audio, but where it becomes most apparent is when the noise is used as a source for the sample and hold. So when the internal noise is used as a modulation source, and here I'm using it to modulate the pitch of a VCO, you can hear how the colour control will affect the range of frequencies that are produced by the module. With a darker noise signal, there's not so much difference between the generated voltages. With a high pass all the way up, you tend to get a lot of higher CV values generated. With clip noise, the difference between the generated voltages are much more significant. And its darkest setting, it's not really reaching the highest and lowest frequencies of the noise signal. And of course this can be controlled by the restrict feature. This is the clock output of the sample and hold module being used as a square wave LFO. So as I increase the speed, it does what you'd expect an LFO to do. But because I've got the output of the clock going through the slew, I can also shape this output into something close to a triangle. And I can still just choose slew up or slew down, making some more interesting modulation shapes. And with exponential switched on, it changes the behaviour of the slope on each pulse.